Hello the world, hello the internet, hello to Jason Isaacs. I'm back! Don't know if you missed me or not, but anyway, I've spent 6 months rearranging my bookshelf, so I think I'm ready for a new video. I've got one coming up on executive orders, United States, how the president does stuff when he can't get the legislation he wants, and I'll be right back after the intro, so we'll cue that and kick straight off. See you in a second. Okay, and we're back. So, how do you talk about executive orders? Well, the smart thing to say about executive orders is that this is what a president generally gets into when Congress won't give him the laws that he needs to get his agenda through. You'll know that separation of powers says that the president can't legislate. That is the reserve of Congress. The president can recommend legislation to Congress, and he'll say he needs this legislation terribly, but it's entirely up to Congress whether or not they do decide to give him that legislation he so deeply craves. When that doesn't happen, the president will inevitably try to get round that particular obstacle, and one way of doing that is through executive orders. There are others, such as signing statements and presidential proclamations. There's one of those coming up, but to all intents and purposes they're variations on a particular theme, and the one that you need to know about, or the one that's really helpful to know about, are these things called executive orders. So let's talk a little bit about what they are and what they're not. We're going to look at the structural approach, where they fit into the picture. We're going to look at the rational and the cultural, as I am wont to do with these particular things. So what are they? And the most important thing there is that these are instructions from the president to the executive branch. So he is now issuing instructions to the civil service. These are not laws. That's really important. They're not laws. Remember, only Congress can pass laws. That's the whole point of the separation of powers. And if you're going to change the shape of the civil state somewhere, then you need to be able to pass laws. If you can't do that, then the next best thing is to try to change the way in which laws are implemented, and that essentially is what we're dealing with here. With executive orders. So these are instructions from the president in his capacity as chief executive to the rest of the executive, particularly to the federal bureaucracy, what the Americans call the civil service, and these are on the implementation of law. And if that sounds a little bit confusing, don't worry. When we look at some of these examples, you'll see how that fits into the general legislative picture. But critically, you're not changing the law here. You're not changing life for someone on Main Street, USA. This is not going to change their life. It's not going to change whatever it is that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. If they work for the federal government, it might, but only if they're working for the federal government, this is going to change anything that they are up to. So remember that these are instructions from the boss to the workers. So the president basically issues a command in his capacity as chief executive. That then goes down to the federal bureaucracy, the civil service. It can change the shape of the federal bureaucracy. It can change the way in which they go about their daily job, about their procedures and their policies. So again, this is going to make more sense when we go into a few examples, but remember what they cannot do. They can't overrule or change the law. It's Congress's jurisdiction. They can't get involved there. They can't raise money because, again, that's Congress. And little note here that becomes very important when you're looking at Trump. If Congress has specifically said, right, here's a huge pile of cash, Mr. President, you can spend it there, but you cannot spend it there, then the president can't use an executive order to redirect funds that have been specifically allocated by Congress to a particular project. So it should be evident straight away that while presidential orders like these, while these executive orders might look like something exciting is happening, in real terms, the impact that they are going to have will be restricted. I nearly said limited. When you think about the range of the executive office, they're not really limited, but they are restricted specifically to the operation of the bureaucracy. Now, what does it mean when the president's firing out executive orders? Well, what it means, and I think this is the single biggest important to take away from it, that we have a breakdown in the relationship between Congress and President. Congress isn't giving the President the laws that he said that he wants. And maybe that's because Congress doesn't want to give them, or maybe it's because Congress is broken itself. We've got that gridlock that we all know and love in Congress, and Congress is unable to generate laws. You all know that Congress is where bills come to die. So if the president has asked Congress for a law and he's not getting that law, it could be one of two reasons, really. Either Congress is going, no, or Congress is going, well, we would, but they won't. So one house is saying, well, we'd pass it, but they won't. We often find that, as I'm sure you find on your American journeys. So Congress may decide just to let the president get on with it. If it needs money, then the president's going to need Congress to allocate that cash. Because remember, the president has no disposable cash. The only cash the president has to spend is the cash that Congress gives him. And if this executive order is going to demand a lot of cash being spent, then he's going to need Congress to allocate those funds. That's the power of the purse. And we're going to look at a couple of examples coming up, with one with Homeland Security, where Congress said, okay, you can have the cash, and another with Trump's border wall, where Congress said, no, we're not going to allocate the cash. And so the wall didn't get built. And that was one occasion when Trump tried to steer cash from one pool to another. And Congress went, don't you even think about it. And had they done that, it would have wound up in the Supreme Court. I'm pretty sure it didn't, but I'll try to remember and check back on that. Sometimes the executive order to be fulfilled will require legislation to be passed. And again, if we look at the Homeland Security, that's going to be relevant there. So that's the Congress and the executive orders. Now let's think about the SCOTUS, because remember, all roads lead to SCOTUS. SCOTUS a few years ago, there was a case whereby SCOTUS did say that EOs were within their jurisdiction, and since then they've been striking them down quite merrily. They've struck down, well, I've got a couple of examples there. DAPA was struck down. Again, we'll talk about that when we get to the DREAM Act. And sometimes it will uphold, sometimes it will knock these down. But certainly the Supreme Court has established jurisdiction over executive orders. And one last point to make about executive orders is that future presidents are not bound by them, or rather future presidents are entirely within their rights to change or rescind or reinstate all of these things. So these are not binding in the sense that a future president can't come in and change them. Because remember, they are an instruction from the chief executive, the chief of the civil service, to the civil service saying, well, do this, or indeed don't do that. So let's have a look at one of those that I mentioned. Now, this is Homeland Security, and this was in the wake of 9/11. I'm sure you all know about 9/11. Now, Bush 43 found at this point that there was no overarching intelligence organization responsible for pulling together the various different intelligence aspects that were at work within the United States. So things like the CIA, the FBI, DEA, ATF, anything to do with internal intelligence, they were all essentially siloed, and this is one of the reasons why the attacks on 9/11 were able to succeed, because there was no single body with overarching responsibility for, including the name, Homeland Security. And so what what Bush 43 did was he passed Executive Order 13228 that you can see there, and what that did was it created the Office of Homeland Security within the White House. Now, this is, you may or may not be familiar with the West Wing, but you've got this huge sprawling area of offices that are within the specific control of the president. That Congress has no oversight over what happens within the executive office of the president. And initially, that's where Bush 43 parked Homeland Security. He then went to Congress and said, oh, by the way, I've created this office. It's called Homeland Security. It's incredibly important. Will you please give me the money to run it? And Congress went, well, hang on a second. How important is this? And Bush said, well, we don't want another one of those attacks. And they said, well, okay, yeah, we understand that. But if it's that important and you need a ton of money from us, then we want to be able to see it. We need to have oversight of this because, of course, one of Congress's roles is oversight of the executive. And they said if it's that important and if it costs that much money, then there's no way it's hiding away inside the White House. We need to see it parked in the federal bureaucracy so that we can have proper oversight for it. And Bush went, okay, fair enough. I think you've made a valid point there. So he passed another executive order. You can see they're all numbered sequentially, so there was quite a few later. It gives you some idea of how many executive orders these guys are passing, which took Homeland Security out of ExOrds, which I've got up there, and parked it instead in the federal bureaucracy. So now Congress has got oversight of what's going on. This is not siloed within the president's exclusive office. They passed the Homeland Security Act of 2002, which created a metric ton of money, which then descended on the Homeland Security, the Department now of Homeland Security, and off it went doing its merry job. So here we've got two executive orders, one establishing the Office of Homeland Security within ExOrds, then a second executive order that transferred the Homeland Security from the White House into the federal bureaucracy as Congress requested. Congress said, thank you very much, we're now going to pass the Homeland Security Act, and it just showered cash on Homeland Security, and that is obviously still a significant part of the federal bureaucracy. That's one example of an ExOrds and Congress working, of the President and Congress essentially working together to get things done. And there are your examples up there. Here's another fun one. This was Obama campaigned. He was going to close down Guantanamo Bay. And as you can see there, in 2009, one of the first things he did was to issue an executive order closing down Guantanamo Bay. Now, if you don't know what Guantanamo Bay is, you should do. Go and check it out. It is the high security prison on Cuba, bizarrely enough, where America parked a lot of the prisoners that it picked up, prisoners, oh gosh, it's complicated, that it picked up while it was engaged in military action in Afghanistan and Iraq. So those prisoners were parked in Guantanamo Bay, and that's a whole different thing with your Boumediene cases, something to look out for. I'm not going to be able to spell it, Boumediene, or what they call the habeas cases, where you had three specific cases in the Supreme Court, Rasool, Hamdan, and Boumediene, RHB, 2006, 2008, and 2009, if memory serves correctly, where we had very, very important cases going through SCOTUS asking whether or not the Constitution applied to Guantanamo Bay, and they decided it did. This was under Bush, so it can't have been 6, 8, and 9. I will correct that in the notes. Watch out for that. So those are your habeas cases. Anyway, the point that I was trying to make here was that Obama campaigned that he was going to close down Guantanamo. He came in, he issued the executive order closing down Guantanamo. Bang, Guantanamo is due for closure. He then has the problem, what am I going to do with all of these prisoners who were previously in Guantanamo? They may or may not have been radical when they went in. After several years of American incarceration, they certainly were radicalized at that point. So he couldn't really release them. He tried to get them into the federal system, and they said, no, we certainly don't want them in the federal prison system. And so regrettably, a couple of years later, having thought long and hard about it, he issued another executive order, reversing his own executive order, and Guantanamo Bay remained open for many, many years. So those are two examples, or two sort of buckets of examples of executive orders, but the one that I really want to look at here is Dream, Dapper and DACA, because here you see what happens when Congress doesn't give the president the legislation he wants. And this has got everything. It's got legislation, it's got executive orders, it's got Supreme Court cases. So what I suggest you do, I'm going to link off to this particular video here. This is an SNL skit to do with what the president does when he doesn't get the legislation he wants. Now, you may recognize this from the famous Schoolhouse Rock video about how a law becomes legislation. Make sure you watch that first. It's about 6 minutes long. And then you've got this one, which is what happens when the president can't get his legislation and decides to act by himself. So I'll see you in a second once you've watched that video. And so we're back. I hope you enjoyed that. I've been watching that every year since it came out, and I do feel slightly sorry for the pupils I got who have to watch that every year, and I'm laughing like an idiot at the back, and they're going, this really isn't very funny. Anyway, so what's going on? DREAM Act. Obama asks the Congress to pass the DREAM Act in 2010. Now note that this was introduced in about 2001, so this is hardly news. For 8-9 years, Congress had been trying to pass this legislation. Eventually it gets passed by the House, but note that that was not an entirely partisan act. We had Democrats voting against it. We had some Democrats voting for it. You go online, you can look up, you can get those numbers. And then it goes to the Senate, and again, we've got Democrats failing to support it. Had those Democrats supported it, it may very well have got past the filibuster. So we're not seeing we're not seeing a payroll vote here. We're seeing people moving in both directions. So that's very, very useful evidence there for congressional failure, congressional inability to pass legislation. Congress has been looking at this for 8-9 years. So Bush was involved way back when. Bush 43, then Obama says, give me the legislation and I will fix this because it urgently needs fixing. But Congress just couldn't do it. And so Obama said, right, enough is enough. And so he passed these two executive orders. Deferred action for childhood arrivals. So in other words, this is for somebody who, a child who had been brought into the country by parents, a child who's been brought in illegally, effectively, but is now sort of part of the American system. The instruction from the chief executive, from the president to the federal branch was, look, just don't prioritize this particular case. Look at the other cases. Look at cases where kids aren't involved. And again, that's the same one here. So these are for kids who had been born in the United States. So they were United States citizens. Even if your parents have come in illegally, if you are born in the United States, you're a United States citizen and eligible to run for president. So in both of these instances, the chief executive, that's the president, is instructing the federal branch, look, just do those cases first. Leave these ones. This is deferred action. It's not giving them legal status. It's giving them a temporary waiver and the right to work while they're there. So it's not like they're suddenly the parents are not immediately becoming American citizens because the president can't do that. He doesn't have the ability to shape the civil state that way. That requires legislation from Congress. But legislation wasn't forthcoming. And so the president said, well, look, I can't change the civil state, but what I can do is I can instruct my workers, my operatives in the federal bureaucracy to prioritize other cases. And so we're not giving them legal status, but we are giving them temporary right to remain while they work, and we'll worry about it later. So, okay, as with all these things, there's a degree of give and take, and that's why everything always ends up in the Supreme Court. Now, DACA went straight into the Supreme Court, and it went into the court system. It was grinding all the way through, and before we could get a definitive judgment, really, Trump came in and issued an executive order reversing DACA, so that was dead, and then in comes Biden, and he reverses the reversal. So essentially DACA is back in operation last time I checked. We then have DAPA, and DAPA was subject to challenge. Well, all of them were subject to challenge. This one effectively was struck down by a federal court. It then went to the Supreme Court. They declined. Sorry about the dogs. They declined to reverse the original decision. So essentially, US versus Texas. The Supreme Court agreed with the lower court that DAPA was unconstitutional, and so it was effectively struck down. So that's where we are. So again, we see that instruction from the president to the executive branch saying, do this, don't do this. So again, an instruction here from the president to the immigration officials saying, look, you've got lots of cases on your desk. Anyone who's got children who are involved at school or who were born in this country and are now citizens, don't deport the parents. So, or rather, prioritize people who haven't got kids. We're going to give these guys a temporary waiver, and that's essentially what DAPA and DACA were about. Again, not law, but to do with the implementation of Congress's law. Congress establishes the law, and the president decides in this instance how he's going to implement it. He's not rejecting the law. He can't reject the law. That's Congress's job. But he's just saying to the immigration officials, you guys have got a pile of work to do. If there's children involved, prioritize the other ones. that's essentially it. We've seen a slew of executive orders, particularly under Trump, because he had that. Well, we'll come to Trump's executive orders in a minute, because there wasn't a minute that went by without those executive orders. And particularly interesting ones there with the travel ban. I do remember when these things were going through, and they were sort of being suspended in the court and then upheld in the court. Ultimately, after 3 goes, the Supreme Court did decide that Trump's executive orders were valid, those particular executive orders were valid, and they let them stand. The thing about these executive orders, and this is the really important bit, and again I'm going to link off to this particular article here. The president can pass almost any executive order he likes, any instruction to the federal branch that he likes. But of course, the more of these that he's passing to the executive branch, the less likely it is that anyone's going to do them, because they're still trying to process the last one. And certainly with Trump, when we had that slew of executive orders from Trump, because it looked like he was acting. This is one of the things about executive orders, and I say it in there somewhere, that it looks like the executive is acting because they're churning out all of these executive orders. Whether or not they're actually having any material impact is a whole different matter. So beware of executive orders. That's not saying that they are not significant. And in my next video, I'm going to look at the drug situation in the United States. And again, there we can see lots of executive orders at work. And I look forward to seeing you there. Questions in the comments. It's great to be back. Love doing these things. Like and subscribe, tell your friends, and questions, areas you want me to cover, things you want to raise. I'm very, very keen for all sorts of feedback, positive and constructive. And I'll see you in the next vids. Enjoy your American politics, folks, and see you all soon. Take care now.